The hills of Okinawa stretched endlessly under the scorching June sun. Heat waves shimmered off limestone ridges. The air hung thick with humidity and death. June 9, 1945, marked another day of horror on this blood-soaked island. Somewhere in those treacherous heights, an American infantry squad pressed themselves against jagged coral rock. Machine gun bullets whined overhead. The sound never stopped. It had been going on for hours. Each burst sent chips of coral flying. Each pause meant the gunner was reloading. Each reload meant maybe 30 seconds of relative safety. The Japanese bunker sat carved deep into the hillside. You couldn't see it unless you knew exactly where to look. The limestone had been hollowed out with hand tools and explosives. Months of patient work had created this killing position. Steel reinforcement beams supported the roof. Concrete lined the walls. The firing aperture was barely visible, just a dark slit in the rock face. Conventional weapons were useless here. Rifle rounds bounced off harmlessly. Grenades couldn't reach the entrance. The position seemed absolutely invincible. American commanders had thrown everything they had at similar bunkers across the island. Nothing worked. Nothing penetrated. Nothing stopped the killing. Then something different appeared on this battlefield. Two soldiers wrestled a peculiar weapon into firing position. The device looked unlike anything most troops had ever seen. A long metal tube rested on stubby bipod legs. The barrel gleamed dull black in the afternoon sun. Strange perforations ringed the breech end. The crew worked with practiced efficiency now. They'd been doing this for days. One soldier cradled the tube while his partner adjusted the bipod. Range to target. 200 yards. Slight upward angle to compensate for trajectory. Wind was minimal. Perfect firing conditions. A sharp metallic crack split the air. Fire erupted from both ends of the weapon simultaneously. Forward blast sent a shell screaming toward the bunker. Backward blast created a cone of superheated gases and debris. The concussion hit nearby soldiers like a physical blow. The hillside simply exploded. Tons of coral and limestone erupted skyward. The bunker aperture vanished in smoke and flying rock. When the debris settled, the machine gun had gone silent. Permanently silent. The position that had dominated this slope for weeks no longer existed. American troops advanced through the settling dust. They moved cautiously at first. Too many times positions had seemed destroyed, only to come alive again with renewed fury. But this time was different. This time, the silence held. Japanese soldiers stumbled from hidden cave entrances. Their ears bled from concussion. Their eyes showed shock and confusion. Many couldn't walk straight. The blast had shattered something more than rock and concrete. It had shattered their confidence in their fortifications. These defenders had never encountered anything like this weapon. They'd been told their positions were impregnable. Engineers had assured them no infantry weapon could penetrate their defenses. Naval bombardment, they could survive. Aerial bombing, they could endure. But this was something entirely new. This was portable artillery in the hands of common foot soldiers. The weapon responsible for this destruction was the M-18 57mm recoilless rifle. Few people had heard of it. Most soldiers didn't know it existed. But it had arrived on Okinawa to change everything about infantry warfare. This story goes far beyond technical specifications. This is about innovation born from desperate necessity. This is about American industrial genius meeting Japanese tactical stubbornness. This is about how a single weapon could shift the psychological balance of an entire campaign. More importantly, this is about the men who carried this revolutionary device into battle. It's about those who faced its terrible power from inside dark caves and concrete bunkers. Both sides would be forever marked by what happened during those final desperate months of Pacific warfare. Understanding the M-18's profound impact requires stepping back from Okinawa's bloody ridges. The story really begins with a problem that had plagued infantry commanders throughout the war. How do you give foot soldiers the devastating firepower of field artillery without crushing them under impossible weight? The challenge seemed unsolvable. Artillery shells delivered tremendous destructive force, but the cannons firing them were massive mechanical beasts. Their recoil was punishing and unforgiving. Newton's third law offered no mercy. For every action comes an equal and opposite reaction. Fire a powerful projectile forward, and the weapon kicks backward with identical force. Heavy guns demanded heavy carriages to absorb this punishment. Thick steel barrels resisted the tremendous pressures. Complex recoil mechanisms channeled and dampened the backward thrust. You simply couldn't hand that kind of devastating power to a two-man infantry team. But two brilliant American engineers disagreed with this conventional wisdom. William Kroger and William Musser thought completely differently about the recoil problem. Working together in 1943, they revisited an old and largely forgotten concept. What if you didn't fight the recoil at all? What if you actually used it? The fundamental concept of recoilless weapons wasn't entirely revolutionary. German engineers had experimented with similar designs earlier in the war. The British had developed their own versions for special applications. But Kroger and Musser refined this principle into something genuinely practical for battlefield use. Their revolutionary weapon would fire a standard artillery shell forward with devastating effect. Simultaneously, it would vent propellant gases backward through a specially designed venturi at the breech. The forward momentum of the projectile and the backward blast of escaping gases would cancel each other out completely. The result would be almost zero recoil. Suddenly, a shoulder-fired cannon became theoretically possible. The two engineers called their creation the Chromusser. This playful name combined their last names in tribute to their collaboration. The official Army designation was considerably less whimsical. The T-15 designation appeared on test reports and procurement documents. When Army Ordnance tested their prototype in November 1943, the results exceeded all expectations. Here was a weapon weighing just 44 pounds that could be carried by two soldiers. It fired high-explosive shells with the devastating punch of a proper field gun. The implications were staggering. By late 1944, the T-15 had been redesignated as the M-18 57mm recoilless rifle. Production orders came flooding in from desperate field commanders. By early 1945, over 2,000 rifles were on order, along with 800,000 rounds of ammunition. American factories were tooling up for massive production runs. But manufacturing weapons was only half the challenge. Getting them to battlefields and into the hands of soldiers who could use them effectively proved equally difficult. The first 50 M-18s shipped to Europe in March 1945. The war there was entering its final chaotic phase. They saw limited action with the 17th Airborne Division during operations near Essen, Germany. Other units employed them during Italy's Po Valley Spring Offensive. The weapon performed adequately in these engagements, but European theater commanders focused on fast-moving mechanized warfare where fighting dwindling German resistance didn't fully grasp what they possessed. The M-18 was certainly impressive in European conditions, but there it was simply another weapon in an already overwhelming arsenal. American forces in Europe enjoyed massive superiority in artillery, air power, and armor. Adding one more infantry weapon to this abundance didn't fundamentally change anything. The Pacific Theater presented a completely different world. By spring 1945, American forces were methodically closing in on Japan itself. Each island campaign had grown progressively bloodier than the last. Iwo Jima had been an absolute nightmare. That volcanic wasteland had been transformed into an underground fortress where every yard of advance cost precious lives. The savage fighting on Iwo Jima had revealed an uncomfortable but undeniable truth. The Japanese had perfected the art of defensive warfare to a terrifying degree. They'd learned through bitter experience that charging American positions was pure suicide. Instead, they had gone underground. Deep underground. Japanese engineers had transformed entire islands into layered defensive networks of staggering complexity. Honeycomb structures of caves, tunnels, and reinforced bunkers covered every approach. All positions were mutually supporting. All were designed to exact maximum casualties before being inevitably overwhelmed. Now came Okinawa, the final stepping stone before an invasion of the Japanese home islands themselves. At 60 miles long and 20 miles wide, Okinawa was the largest island Americans would assault in the Pacific. It was also by far the most heavily fortified position they had ever encountered. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded approximately 100,000 Japanese troops. These forces had spent months preparing for the inevitable American assault. They understood perfectly they couldn't achieve victory in any conventional sense. That had never been their objective from the beginning. Their goal was simpler and infinitely more terrible. Make the Americans pay such a horrific price in blood that they would hesitate before attempting an invasion of Japan itself. Every Japanese death should cost multiple American lives. Every position should exact maximum carnage before falling. Ushijima's defensive strategy was methodical and utterly ruthless. Unlike previous island commanders who had squandered men in futile charges or desperate banzai attacks, he understood that American firepower superiority meant any force caught in the open would be annihilated instantly. His men didn't stay in the open. They focused their defensive efforts on Okinawa's southern half. The hilly terrain there was perfect for defensive warfare. Volcanic limestone could be carved and shaped with relative ease. Underground positions were possible on a massive scale. Japanese engineers had created elaborate networks deep inside the hillsides. These positions were virtually invisible from aircraft flying overhead. They were resistant to naval bombardment from the most powerful ships. Artillery pieces could be wheeled into caves, fired at American positions, then pulled back before counter-battery fire could respond. Machine gun nests were positioned to cover every conceivable approach route. Often multiple positions had overlapping fields of fire from neighboring bunkers. Bunkers themselves were reinforced with concrete and steel beams. Camouflage was so thorough that soldiers could walk past positions without realizing they were there. The centerpiece of this defensive network was the Shuri Line. This position was anchored at historic Shuri Castle. It was supported by a series of fortified ridges, whose names would become synonymous with horror and death. Kakazu Ridge, Hacksaw Ridge, Sugarloaf Hill. Each individual position was designed to defend not just itself, but the approaches to the next position in line. Taking one ridge didn't mean advancing toward victory. It meant facing another ridge that was equally well defended and equally deadly. American forces would have to clear every hill, every cave, every fortified position individually. There would be no flanking maneuvers around these positions. There would be no clever tactical shortcuts to victory. Just brutal, grinding frontal assault against prepared positions. Each bunker would have to be reduced by direct attack. Each cave system would have to be cleared by hand. On April 1, 1945, more than 6,000 American soldiers and Marines stormed ashore at Okinawa. This was the largest amphibious landing of the entire Pacific War. The date would later acquire a grim and bitter irony among survivors. The landing itself was eerily quiet and almost unopposed by enemy forces. Soldiers who had braced themselves for another bloodbath instead found empty beaches stretching before them. Some nervous troops joked about April Fool's Day, but seasoned officers knew better than to trust this calm. The Japanese weren't abandoning Okinawa to American forces. They were waiting patiently in their prepared positions. They were watching every American move. They were drawing the invaders deeper inland where the real killing could begin. For the first few days, the American advance proceeded with surprising rapidity. Marines pushed north across the island, encountering only scattered resistance from small delaying forces. Army units moved south, cutting the island in half with relative ease. Then, on April 8th, everything changed forever. American forces advancing southward ran headlong into the first defensive positions of the Shuri Line. The quiet war became a screaming nightmare of unprecedented intensity. Suddenly, seemingly empty hillsides erupted with devastating fire from multiple directions. Machine guns opened up from hidden positions that couldn't be seen or targeted. Mortars rained down with uncanny accuracy because Japanese observers had pre-registered every inch of ground. Artillery shells screamed in from caves the Americans couldn't even locate. Men who had survived the Pacific War's bloodiest campaigns found themselves facing something completely new and terrifying. An enemy who had months to prepare every position, who knew every rock and fold of terrain intimately, who could disappear into the earth itself and emerge behind advancing troops. This was exactly the battlefield the M-18 had been designed for. Though nobody involved had quite realized it yet, the weapon's creators had originally envisioned it as portable anti-tank artillery, a way to give paratroopers and light infantry units heavy firepower against armored vehicles. The M-18 could certainly serve that role effectively. It fired 4 distinct types of ammunition for different tactical situations. A high-explosive anti-tank round could penetrate about 76 millimeters of armor plating. A standard high-explosive round was designed for bunkers and fortifications. A white phosphorus smoke round provided screening and marking capabilities. A practice round allowed for training without wasting expensive ammunition. The anti-tank capability was certainly useful in Pacific conditions, but it wasn't particularly revolutionary compared to existing weapons. The 2.36-inch bazooka could already handle most enemy armor effectively. The M-18's armor penetration was actually slightly less effective than the bazooka's best rocket rounds. What nobody had fully appreciated during development was what the M-18 could accomplish against fortified positions. That high-explosive round, delivered with true artillery-level force from a man-portable weapon, was absolutely devastating against bunkers and cave entrances. The white phosphorus round could flush defenders from cave systems or mark targets for supporting fire from other units. Most critically, the weapon was remarkably accurate compared to rocket launchers. Unlike bazookas, whose unguided projectiles could veer wildly off course, the M-18 fired stabilized shells from a rifled barrel. It could hit point targets out to 400 meters with the heat round. It could engage area targets at over 1,000 meters with high explosive and white phosphorus ammunition. That range and accuracy meant infantry squads could engage Japanese positions from distances that previously required calling in artillery or air support. Perhaps most importantly, the M-18 was genuinely mobile despite its weight. At 44 pounds, it was certainly heavy for a shoulder weapon, much heavier than a bazooka or other infantry weapons, but it was infinitely lighter than the smallest field gun in the Army inventory. 2 men could carry the complete weapon system. One soldier carried the rifle itself. The other carried the bipod ammunition and accessories. Additional soldiers served as ammunition bearers, with each man capable of carrying 3 rounds in modified bazooka carrying bags. The entire crew could keep pace with advancing infantry formations. They could set up and fire within minutes of reaching a position. Then they could displace rapidly, before Japanese counterfire could zero in on their location. This was truly pocket artillery, exactly what infantry commanders had been dreaming of throughout the war. The first M-18s finally arrived on Okinawa on June 9, 1945. More than 2 months had passed since the campaign began. By then, the battle had devolved into exactly the kind of grinding attritional warfare the weapon was specifically designed to break. American casualties were mounting to horrific levels that shocked even veteran commanders. The ridges and hills south of the Shuri Line had become vast graveyards. Soldiers were being killed or wounded by defenders they often never saw, firing from positions that seemed absolutely impossible to neutralize with conventional weapons. Flamethrower teams could clear individual caves if they could somehow get close enough to the entrances. But approaching a defended cave opening through concentrated machine gun fire was usually suicide. Artillery could pound hillsides into rubble for hours, but Japanese defenders inside their deep tunnel systems simply waited for each barrage to end. Then they emerged to repel the inevitable infantry assault that followed. Into this nightmare came the first M-18 crews, fresh weapons in hand, eager to prove what their revolutionary new rifle could accomplish. The first engagements were almost experimental in nature. Soldiers who had spent weeks trying to dislodge Japanese positions with grenades and satchel charges and small arms fire suddenly had a weapon that could hit bunker apertures from hundreds of yards away. The effect was immediate and absolutely dramatic. Positions that had held out for days or weeks were suddenly vulnerable to direct fire. The Japanese masters of defensive warfare found themselves facing a threat they hadn't fully accounted for during their meticulous preparations. Infantry units with true artillery capability. The psychological impact proved as significant as the physical destruction the weapon caused. Japanese soldiers in caves and bunkers had grown genuinely confident in their fortifications over months of combat. They had weathered bombardments from the most powerful naval guns. They had survived repeated aerial attacks. They had held against wave after wave of infantry assault. Their positions were strong and carefully sighted and mutually supporting. But the M-18 fundamentally changed the tactical equation they faced. Now, small American units could bring devastating firepower to bear quickly and precisely and repeatedly without warning. There was no advance warning of incoming naval shells whistling through the air. There was no time to take cover from airstrikes building overhead. Just the sudden shocking arrival of a 57mm shell fired by 2 soldiers crouched behind rocks 300 yards away. Japanese defenders discovered that positions which had seemed absolutely invulnerable were suddenly penetrable by infantry weapons. Bunkers that could withstand rifle fire and even small mortar rounds couldn't survive direct hits from M-18 shells. The white phosphorus rounds were particularly terrifying. They produced clouds of burning smoke that penetrated cave systems and forced defenders into the open where supporting infantry could engage them. Even when shells didn't achieve direct penetration, the concussive force inside confined spaces was absolutely devastating. Veterans later described the complete disorientation and shock of being inside a cave when an M-18 shell detonated near the entrance. Pressure waves stunned everyone inside. Ears bled from the concussion. Lungs burned from the blast effects. But we're getting ahead of the complete story here. To truly understand what happened when the M-18 encountered Japanese defenders on Okinawa, we need to understand both sides of this desperate struggle. the American soldiers learning to wield this revolutionary new weapon effectively, and the Japanese troops trying to comprehend what had suddenly made their carefully prepared fortifications obsolete. This wasn't simply about technology advancing warfare. This was about men facing each other across impossible terrain, both sides believing absolutely in their cause, both sides terrified of what lay ahead, both sides doing what they believed they had to do to survive. In that moment, during those final desperate months of the war, a weapon emerged that embodied everything separating these two forces. American industrial innovation confronting Japanese tactical stubbornness. Overwhelming resources meeting absolutely unyielding spirit and determination. The real story of the M-18 on Okinawa begins not with technical specifications or tactical manuals. It begins with the men who carried it into battle, and with those who faced its terrible power from inside dark caves and concrete bunkers. Both sides wondering how the rules of warfare had changed so suddenly and so completely. Private First Class James Morrison crouched behind a shattered coral outcrop. His hands trembled slightly as he loaded another round into the M-18's breech. He had been fighting on Okinawa for 3 solid weeks. Every single day felt like an entire year of combat. The weapon resting across his lap was still unfamiliar despite days of practice. It had arrived just recently, with promises from officers that it would change everything about infantry warfare. Now, staring at a cave entrance 200 yards up the slope, he wondered desperately if those promises contained any truth. That cave had been spitting machine gun fire for 6 straight hours. 2 entire squads had attempted to approach the position. Neither attempt had succeeded. Both had ended in casualties and retreat. Now, it was Morrison's turn to prove what this strange rifle could accomplish against prepared defenses. The stories of soldiers like Morrison were scattered across the southern hills of Okinawa during those final months of the war. They reveal what the M-18 really meant beyond its impressive technical specifications and official capabilities. This wasn't simply about a new weapon system. This was about soldiers pushed beyond their breaking point, being given a tool that seemed almost miraculous. They were facing an enemy equally desperate and equally determined. But suddenly, that enemy was vulnerable in ways they had never experienced before. Training with the M-18 had been necessarily rushed and abbreviated. The weapon arrived on Okinawa while fierce battles still raged across the island. There simply wasn't time for weeks of careful practice and familiarization. Crews learned the absolute basics quickly: how to properly load the perforated cartridge case, how to check the venturi at the breech for obstructions, how to account for the dangerous backblast that could kill anyone standing directly behind the weapon. The weapon's designers had created something genuinely brilliant but completely unforgiving in its operation. That venturi, the carefully shaped opening that channeled propellant gases backward to counteract recoil, meant every single firing position had to be chosen with extreme care. Fire from inside a building, and the backblast would destroy your hearing permanently. It would probably set the entire structure on fire. Fire too close to a wall or embankment, and the gases reflecting back could seriously injure or kill the entire crew. But fire from the right position, with adequate clear space behind you, and you could deliver absolutely devastating firepower with almost zero recoil. The learning curve was steep and unforgiving, but it was absolutely necessary for survival. Early crews made painful mistakes that taught hard lessons. Some positioned themselves too close to obstacles and learned about reflected blast pressure the hard way. Others underestimated the weapon's range capabilities and found themselves unable to effectively engage distant targets. But combat was the ultimate teacher, and soldiers adapted with remarkable speed. Within days, M-18 crews had developed sophisticated tactics that maximized the weapon's considerable strengths while minimizing its limitations. They learned to coordinate with infantry squads, providing devastating covering fire as riflemen maneuvered against positions. They learned which specific ammunition worked best for different types of targets. High explosive rounds for concrete bunkers, white phosphorus for extensive cave systems, heat rounds for occasional Japanese tanks or pillboxes with particularly thick protective walls. What they discovered was that the M-18 gave them tactical options they had never possessed before in Pacific warfare. Previously, encountering a heavily fortified position meant choosing from several costly alternatives. You could call for artillery support if it was available and if forward observers could accurately spot the target. You could request air support, but aircraft were in desperately high demand across the entire battlefield. You could attempt to work in close with flamethrower teams, but that meant exposing specialized units to intense fire as they approached defended positions. Or you could simply assault the position directly with rifle infantry, accepting horrific casualties as the inevitable price of success. The M-18 changed this tactical equation fundamentally and permanently. Now, a squad-level unit could engage fortified positions directly and immediately without waiting for support assets that might be hours away or never arrive at all. For Japanese defenders inside their carefully prepared positions, the arrival of the M-18 represented a nightmare they hadn't anticipated during months of preparation. Their entire defensive strategy had been built on certain assumptions about American infantry capabilities. They knew about American artillery superiority. That's exactly why they had dug so deep, creating positions that could withstand even heavy naval bombardment from offshore battleships. They understood American air power dominance. That's why their positions were so thoroughly camouflaged and concealed from aerial observation. The Japanese defenders possessed intimate knowledge about flamethrowers and their devastating capabilities. This understanding shaped their entire defensive philosophy. Multiple escape routes honeycomb every fortified position. Tunnels connected bunkers to caves. Secondary exits opened onto different slopes. When Americans attacked one entrance with their terrifying liquid fire, defenders could vanish through alternate passages. Their tactical knowledge ran deep and comprehensive. Every American operation had been dissected and analyzed. Guadalcanal's lessons were absorbed completely. Tarawa's brutal beach assaults were studied obsessively. Saipan's coordinated attacks were memorized down to squad-level movements. Iwo Jima's horrific casualties provided final confirmation of American methods. Japanese military intelligence understood their enemy's approach with scientific precision. American warfare followed predictable patterns. Overwhelming firepower preceded every assault. Artillery barrages lasted for hours. Naval guns pounded positions methodically. Airstrikes softened targets systematically. Then came the infantry advance, slow and deliberate, supported by every available weapon. Machine guns covered every movement. Mortars sealed off escape routes. The M-18 shattered these carefully constructed defensive calculations. This weapon defied every assumption about infantry capabilities. Here stood individual soldiers carrying artillery-level destruction. Positions engineered to resist rifle fire crumbled under direct hits. Bunkers designed to withstand indirect bombardment collapsed from precision strikes. Two men could deliver what previously required entire artillery batteries. Physical destruction was only part of the weapon's impact. Psychological devastation proved equally catastrophic. Japanese soldiers drew their strength from their fortifications. Rock walls provided security. Multiple firing positions offered tactical options. Concealed entrances gave strategic surprise. These men understood their numerical disadvantage. They accepted their ultimate defeat. But they believed passionately in their ability to extract terrible costs. Every position would demand American blood. Each bunker would claim multiple attackers. Every cave system would become a charnel house. This belief sustained them through months of preparation. The M-18 demolished that sustaining faith in minutes. Historical records from Japanese survivors paint vivid pictures of encountering this new weapon. One former Imperial Army soldier shared his memories decades after the war ended. His interview revealed the shock of facing unprecedented firepower. They had complete confidence in their bunker's impregnability. Solid rock surrounded their position on 3 sides. Multiple firing ports covered different approaches. Their entrance remained invisible from most angles. American infantry had tested their defenses repeatedly. Probing attacks came daily. Machine gun bursts answered every approach. Rifle fire drove back reconnaissance teams. Their position seemed untouchable. Week after week confirmed their invulnerability. Then, one morning brought something entirely different. A projectile struck their position with tremendous force, much larger than any rifle-fired round. The explosion exceeded anything they had experienced. Rock dust filled their lungs instantly. Ceiling stones crashed downward. Choking particles blinded everyone momentarily. Before recovery was possible, another shell arrived. Then another followed immediately. The bunker they considered impregnable was being systematically demolished, stone by stone, firing port by firing port. Their fortress became their tomb. The soldier and his surviving comrades retreated deeper into the cave network. They abandoned a position held for weeks. Their confidence evaporated with the dust settling around collapsed walls. Okinawa's terrain made the M-18 particularly devastating. The island's southern hills presented nightmarish fighting conditions. Broken ground extended everywhere. Steep slopes rose at impossible angles. Narrow valleys channeled all movement. Wheeled artillery couldn't navigate this landscape. Even tracked vehicles struggled with the terrain. Most heavy weapons remained stranded below. When artillery could reach elevated positions, accuracy suffered dramatically. Indirect fire meant shells fell randomly. Point targets like cave entrances proved nearly impossible to hit. Gunners fired based on map coordinates. Forward observers struggled to spot impacts. Adjustment rounds alerted defenders to incoming danger. M-18 crews operated under completely different parameters. They positioned anywhere infantry could climb, often mere hundreds of yards from their targets. Direct fire eliminated guesswork about accuracy. Crews could see their targets clearly. Impact points were immediately visible. Adjustments happened instantly. Missed distance dropped to mere feet instead of hundreds of yards. White phosphorus rounds proved especially effective against cave networks. White phosphorus burns at incredibly high temperatures. The chemical reaction produces thick white smoke that penetrates confined spaces. When M-18 crews placed phosphorus rounds into cave entrances, smoke filled entire tunnel systems within minutes. Defenders faced impossible choices rapidly. The smoke burned lungs and eyes viciously. Heat ignited equipment and uniforms. Breathing became increasingly difficult. They could retreat deeper into caves and risk suffocation, or they could emerge into open ground and face machine gun fire. Neither option offered survival. Survivors described the absolute terror of these chemical attacks. Smoke burned every exposed surface. Eyes streamed tears constantly. Breathing required tremendous effort. The heat felt intense enough to cook exposed skin. Equipment began smoldering spontaneously. Uniforms caught fire without warning. The choice between underground death and surface execution drove many to panic. Yet understanding the M-18's limitations remains crucial. This weapon never functioned as a magical solution, ending battles overnight. Okinawa continued grinding forward as a brutal campaign testing American forces beyond all previous limits. The psychological toll on American soldiers reached unprecedented levels. Combat fatigue casualties represented significant portions of non-combat losses. Men broke completely under relentless stress. Day after day brought identical horrors. Clearing fortified positions never ended. Friends died with predictable regularity. Tomorrow promised more of the same suffering. The M-18 provided help, certainly. Infantry units gained additional firepower and tactical options, but the weapon never made fighting easy or safe. Each Japanese position required individual location and approach. Defenders maintained their skill and determination throughout. They adapted tactics continuously based on American innovations. Deeper positions incorporated more right-angled turns. These configurations absorbed blast effects from penetrating shells. Forces dispersed more widely across terrain. Single weapons could no longer neutralize multiple positions simultaneously. Sniper activity increased dramatically. Infiltration tactics targeted M-18 crews specifically. Japanese marksmen tried eliminating crews before weapons could deploy. The battle remained a deadly chess match. Both sides learned constantly and adapted immediately. Casualty statistics tell only part of Okinawa's story. American losses totaled approximately 49,000 personnel. More than 12,000 died or went missing permanently. These figures represented roughly 35% of the entire assault force. Such casualty rates were devastating by any military standard. Physical wounds accompanied psychological trauma universally. More than 25,000 non-battle casualties included thousands suffering from combat fatigue. The fighting's intensity broke experienced veterans and new recruits equally. Among those casualties was Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. The 10th Army commander died from artillery fire on June 18th. He became the highest-ranking American officer killed during World War II. Japanese losses exceeded all previous Pacific campaigns. Approximately 110,000 Japanese soldiers and conscripted Okinawan defenders died during the fighting. Prisoner numbers exceeded 16,000. This figure was unprecedented for Japanese forces throughout the entire war. It reflected the complete collapse of their defensive system during the final weeks. Civilian casualties perhaps represent the most tragic aspect. Estimates suggest between 100,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians died during the battle. These innocent people found themselves caught between two massive armies. Artillery fire killed indiscriminately. Aerial bombardment struck without warning. Japanese forces conscripted civilians against their will. Some cases involved mass suicide after propaganda convinced families that American capture meant torture and death. The suffering scale on Okinawa appalled military planners preparing for Japan's home island invasion. If Okinawa, a relatively small island with pre-war civilian population around 490,000, cost so many lives, what would Kyushu or Honshu invasions mean? The calculations produced staggering and terrifying projections. Operation Olympic, the planned Kyushu invasion scheduled for November 1945, was projected to cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties. Operation Coronet, the subsequent Honshu invasion, would likely prove even worse. Japanese forces were preparing defensive positions throughout the home islands. Every available person was being mobilized. plans called for fighting in every village and city. President Harry Truman, who assumed office after Franklin Roosevelt's death on April 12th, made his atomic weapons decision within this context. The debate over this decision continues today, but Okinawa's influence on American strategic thinking remains undeniable. The fighting's brutality shocked even hardened military leaders. Japanese forces' refusal to surrender seemed absolute. Civilian involvement in defense suggested invasion would bring catastrophe beyond imagination. Atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th. The Soviet Union declared war on August 8th. Japan surrendered shortly afterward. The invasion that would have dwarfed even Okinawa's horror never occurred. Our story focuses primarily on the M-18 and its representation of American fighting methods during the war's final months. The weapon embodied several key advantages that characterized American military culture throughout the conflict. Innovation stood first among these advantages. The M-18 wasn't merely an incremental improvement over existing weapons. It represented a fundamentally new approach to providing infantry with heavy firepower capabilities. Engineers thought outside traditional parameters. They questioned basic assumptions about weapon design. They created something genuinely revolutionary. Industrial capability provided the second crucial advantage. From initial concept to mass production required less than 2 years. Thousands of weapons rolled off production lines. Hundreds of thousands of rounds were manufactured simultaneously. American industry achieved this while producing ships, aircraft, tanks, and every other implement of modern warfare. Adaptability formed the third essential advantage. The weapon reached Okinawa while fighting raged across the island. Integration into combat operations happened immediately. Tactics developed organically by soldiers who had never seen recoilless rifles weeks earlier. Field experience drove rapid tactical evolution. These advantages didn't guarantee victory or reduce casualties to acceptable levels, but they created conditions Japanese forces couldn't possibly match. By 1945, Japan's industrial capacity lay in ruins. Their ability to innovate and mass-produce new weapons had collapsed completely. American submarine warfare strangled supply lines effectively. Strategic bombing destroyed factories systematically. Japanese soldiers on Okinawa fought with undeniable courage and skill, but they did so with weapons and equipment that were increasingly obsolete. Quantities proved insufficient for sustained combat. No prospect existed for reinforcement or resupply. The contrast extended far beyond equipment to fundamental philosophy. American military culture emphasized problem-solving at every level. Initiative was encouraged among junior leaders. Rapid adaptation to changing circumstances became standard operating procedure. When M-18s arrived, squad leaders and company commanders immediately began experimenting. How could this weapon be employed most effectively? What tactics worked best in specific terrain? Lessons learned in one sector spread quickly across units. Information sharing happened constantly. By war's end, institutional knowledge about recoilless rifle employment had been developed, documented, and disseminated thoroughly. This knowledge would prove invaluable in subsequent conflicts. Recoilless rifles became standard infantry weapons during the Korean War and beyond. For Japanese forces, the M-18 represented something far more significant than just another weapon system. It symbolized the complete impossibility of their strategic situation. Throughout the war, Japanese propaganda emphasized spirit over material advantages. Courage would overcome technology, according to official doctrine. Soldiers learned that willingness to die for the emperor would overcome American material superiority. On Okinawa, that narrative collapsed completely and permanently. No amount of fighting spirit could protect against direct hits from 57mm high explosive shells. No amount of courage could make bunkers immune to white phosphorus attacks. American firepower superiority became undeniably real, immediate, and lethal. Yet even facing certain defeat, Japanese defenders on Okinawa fought with tenacity that earned grudging respect from their enemies. American veterans remembered not just the M-18 or other technological advantages. They remembered the human cost paid by both sides. They remembered comrades who never returned home. They remembered exhaustion that penetrated to their bones. They remembered fear that never completely disappeared. Some veterans remembered moments of compassion amid brutal fighting, offering water to wounded Japanese soldiers. The surrender of defenders who finally had enough. The heartbreaking discovery of civilian casualties caught in crossfire. These human moments provided brief respite from mechanical killing. The Battle of Okinawa officially ended on June 22, 1945. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima and his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, committed ritual suicide at their command post, but echoes of that battle would resonate for decades into the future. The island, once a relatively peaceful Japanese prefecture, transformed into a massive American military base. Even today, 80 years later, significant American military facilities remain on Okinawa. This presence represents a direct legacy of that terrible spring and summer in 1945. The M-18 itself continued serving well beyond World War II's conclusion. During the Korean War, each Army Rifle Company received authorization for 3 M-18 recoilless rifles. Veterans of that conflict reported continued effectiveness, particularly against machine gun nests and fortified positions. Eventually, larger recoilless rifles superseded the M-18 for anti-tank roles. The 75mm M20 and 106mm M40 offered greater firepower, but the basic principle pioneered by the M-18 remained constant. Give infantry direct-fire artillery capability in man-portable packages. Looking back across decades, the M-18's impact on Okinawa was both tactical and symbolic simultaneously. Tactically, it provided American infantry with tools that helped reduce casualties inherent in attacking fortified positions. It wasn't a decisive wonder weapon winning battles alone, but it proved a valuable addition to American arsenal that made impossible jobs somewhat less impossible. Symbolically, it represented the culmination of American advantages throughout the Pacific War. Innovation, industrial capacity, and ability to rapidly field new technology all combined in this single weapon system. For Japanese soldiers facing it, the M-18 provided one more reminder of their strategic situation's hopelessness. They had been sent to Okinawa, knowing they would die there. The M-18 simply made that death more certain and immediate. Modern analysts sometimes criticize American use of overwhelming firepower as wasteful or excessive. But soldiers who fought on Okinawa held different perspectives. They saw friends cut down by hidden machine guns daily. They spent weeks clearing cave systems that seemed endless. Any weapon that might save even a few American lives was welcomed enthusiastically. The human dimension of this story extends far beyond battlefield experiences. Think about engineers who designed the M-18. They worked late into countless nights solving technical problems. They never knew if their creation would arrive in time to matter. Think about factory workers producing weapons and ammunition. Many were women filling roles vacated by men at the front. Think about families back home reading casualty lists in newspapers. They wondered constantly if their loved ones were among the fallen. Think about Okinawan civilians watching their island transform into a battlefield. Their homes were destroyed systematically. Their lives were shattered by wars they never requested. Consider the aftermath's complexity. American soldiers returned home carrying memories they couldn't forget. Wounds, both visible and invisible, would last entire lifetimes. Japanese survivors, including Okinawan civilians, rebuilt from ruins in a fundamentally changed world. Decision-makers weighed war's terrible calculus. How many lives was victory worth? What means were acceptable to achieve that victory? Questions raised so starkly by Okinawa remain relevant today. The M-18's story ultimately becomes a human story. It's about innovation born from desperate needs to save lives. It's about soldiers trying to survive impossible situations. It's about war's terrible cost, regardless of who wins or loses. The weapon itself was merely a tool. Impressive in its engineering, certainly, but meaningless without men who carried it, fired it, maintained it, and faced it from the other side of the battlefield. When guns finally fell silent on Okinawa, when the last cave was cleared and final defensive position overrun, the island lay in complete ruins. More than 250,000 people had died during 3 months of fighting. Southern Okinawa resembled a cratered wasteland. The island's natural beauty was buried under war's debris. The M-18, along with thousands of other weapons, was packed up and shipped to next operations or back to depots. Soldiers who wielded it moved on to occupation duty or returned home. They carried memories of what they had done and seen, but that weapon's impact and what it represented echoed forward through history continuously. It influenced post-war weapons development, leading to increasingly sophisticated recoilless weapon systems. It shaped tactical thinking about providing infantry units greater firepower. On human levels, it became part of stories told by hundreds of thousands of men who fought on Okinawa. Both sides faced death daily. They showed courage and fear in equal measure. They were forever changed by their experiences. Today, the M-18 exists primarily in museums and private collections. It's become a relic of a vanished war. But questions it raises remain urgent and immediate. How do we give soldiers tools they need while minimizing casualties? How do we balance tactical effectiveness against humanitarian concerns? How do we remember war's human cost? Individual stories behind statistics? Faces behind numbers? Soldiers who fought on Okinawa, American and Japanese alike, deserve remembrance not just as statistics in history books. They should be remembered as individuals facing impossible circumstances with courage. They fought for what they believed in. They suffered and died far from home. Civilians caught in crossfire deserve remembrance as innocent victims of conflicts they didn't start and couldn't stop. The weapon giving this story its title, the M-18 57mm recoilless rifle, deserves understanding not just as military hardware. It should be recognized as a symbol of both human ingenuity and war's terrible necessities. When we look back at Okinawa, at the M-18, at the entire bloody final year of Pacific War, we confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and human conflict. We're reminded that wars are fought not by nations or ideologies, but by individual human beings. They make impossible choices under unimaginable stress. We're reminded that technological advantages can shorten wars but never make them easy or clean. We're reminded that victory's cost, even necessary victory, is always measured in lives that can never be recovered, in suffering that can never be undone. The M-18 recoilless rifle arrived on Okinawa on June 9, 1945. Just 13 days remained before the battle ended. It fought during the final, most brutal phase of the campaign. In hills and caves of southern Okinawa, where fighting reached peak intensity. Did it change the ultimate outcome? Perhaps not fundamentally. Would American forces have eventually prevailed without it? Almost certainly, given their overwhelming advantages in men and material. But for soldiers who carried it, who used it to neutralize positions that seemed invincible, who survived because they could engage enemies from distance rather than charging into machine gun fire, the M-18 mattered profoundly and personally. This represents the M-18's legacy on Okinawa. Not a war-winning superweapon, but a tool making impossible jobs slightly less impossible. It saved some lives while taking others. It represented the best and worst of human ingenuity applied to organized violence problems. It's a story worth remembering. Not to glorify war or weapons, but to understand conflict's human dimensions, the real cost of victory. The debt we owe those who fought and died during World War II's closing months, in hills and caves of an island called Okinawa.